You've waited all year, and it's finally here. Today's the day. Old Navy's famous $1 flip-flops are back for just 1 day only. Polish up your petties and hurry in for flip-flops for the whole family for just $1. Today only at Old Navy and OldNavy.com. Valid 6/24, limit 10, solid colors only.
Blog Talk Radio.
Listeners, this is a pre-recorded segment of Radio Free Kansas. No calls, please, during this hour. You'll be able to make phone calls during the second hour. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, please pay attention to this program summary underneath the show, the description, and they'll give you some instructions on how to contact our guest, author Dan Kovalik, and our Tuesday, This Can't Be Happening, co-host John Grant. They're both coming on. I want to give a few short words to Mr. Kovalik. He graduated from the Columbia School in New York City, and he teaches now at the University of Pittsburgh International Human Rights Law. He's traveled extensively. Both John and when I was, you can listen to, you can actually read some of the introduction to his book, The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, on the internet, and it's quite generous. And you'll find out from the introduction that's in there, Dan wrote, that he and John Grant share quite a bit in common, and about their travels into Central and South America. And John Grant, no further introductions necessary for John Grant, because every Tuesday you can catch up with him and I on This Can't Be Happening on Tuesdays. Okay, it's over to you, John, and thank you for coming on, Mr. Kovalik.
My pleasure. Well, I want to welcome Dan, and we're going to talk about his book, The Plot to Scapegoat Russia. how the CIA and the deep state have conspired to vilify Russia. I guess let me start by asking Dan how he decided to write this book. What provoked him to write this book?
Well, it grew out of an article that I wrote on Huffington Post called "Listen, Liberals, Russia's Not Our Enemy," and of course, I've been very alarmed by the increasing anti-Russia hysteria, which even predated, of course, the 2016 elections. I mean, it's just growing hostility towards Russia, which I think is not only unjustified, but I think is quite dangerous. And that's what led me to write this book, to try to take on this narrative that Russia is somehow a threat to us, and also to bring it from more of a kind of left-wing perspective, because, of course, those who are defensive of Trump, are obviously opposed to the Russiagate scandal for their own reasons, but I'm against it for, what I view are principled reasons, because I'm a peace activist and someone who does not want to see conflict with Russia.
Right. Well, I think, it's a really interesting topic because it's in the news everywhere. I mean, as it is a, hysteria, I suppose, is a fair word. And at one point in here, I forget where exactly it was, but you talked about the shrinking Russian state being one of the problems here that is involved in all this. But it seemed to me that you also have to consider, and I think you do, the shrinking United States state, if you will. That we're in a position of decline in the imperial history of the United States, as we face the rise of the internet, the rise of all kinds of new technology, and the breakdown of the nation states, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1624, whatever it was, and that the creation of new power centers with corporations and whatnot, and that the world is breaking down, and the United States is shrinking as the Russians are shrinking. Russia is shrinking with certainly the death of the Soviet Union. That all of this is happening, and the United States, those in power, entrenched in the power, are become quite scared, and so they are looking for scapegoats, to use your term. I think it really fits in there. How do you see that as an overarching kind of struggle at this point in, say, circa 2017, with the world reshifting, if you will, into a new sort of struggle amongst nations?
Yes, well, I think you raise a good point that the U.S. itself, I wouldn't say is shrinking, but I definitely would say is weakening. The economy is weakening. And you have what I view as the worst of all worlds. Our military is not shrinking. It continues to grow. We continue to be a powerful military force, but a weaker and weaker economic force, and a weaker and weaker political force in the world. We do not have the same cachet that we used to have either. So what we have left is brute force, which we use very liberally around the world. And I do think there are people in power in the United States who may be thinking that, a bigger war is the only way to get us out of this, economic malaise that we're in. And that concerns me greatly. And as you say, we need to continue to drum up enemies to justify this ridiculous military spending, which, while we're cutting health care, while we can't fix bridges, I heard a statistic that there are 6,500 bridges in the U.S. in urgent need of repair, right?
I think the state with the largest number is my state of Pennsylvania.
It's just incredible. So, we can't take care of our people. We can't take care of our infrastructure. but we continue to spend money on the military, which of course is a form of welfare for these defense contractors and whatnot.
Certainly, yeah. War profiteers.
Exactly. And it's to deal with the reserve army of labor to keep unemployment down by sending poor people to fight in these far-flung places. So it's a quite, terrible situation. And what's sad about it to me, amongst other things, is that it's not even up for debate. There's no debate between the two parties about the military expenditures we have. Obama was just as militaristic as anyone. There was no opposition to his wars. Obviously he inherited some wars, but no one opposed that, him up in the ante in Afghanistan or Iraq, or his foray into Libya, which was horrible for the world, frankly. And no one said boo. And so now when Trump comes to power, not only are people continue to be mute on those issues, now the Democrats have bizarrely seized upon this Russiagate thing for political expediency, and so they're beating the drums of war more than anyone. In fact, I saw a story this morning from Fairness Fairness, Accuracy, and Reporting, FAIR for short. It was an analysis of MSNBC and how they, some of their coverage on its face seems to be almost welcoming a war with Russia, and it's absolutely bizarre.
Well, again, we mentioned shares with your publisher, Malcolm Nance, is on, pretty much on MSNBC every other night. Well, I guess right now it's come out a lot of testimony. I think yesterday there was some testimony that it seems pretty clear that the Russians are involved in, what do you call it, hacking, cyber war, or just, as even Vladimir Putin said, I'm not responsible for patriotic Russians who are messing with American internet issues and things like that. Certainly we do it. I think you point that out, that this is just kind of the state of this internet-saturated world that we have, that that our lives, or the quotidian minutia of our lives, have gone from two-dimensional chess, if you will, to three-dimensional chess. We're now in this new cyber world that people can connect with instantaneously around, the globe, and actually, cause havoc and harassment and all this kind of stuff. So, you don't dispute that happened during. Well,
I certainly think. Well, let me say what I do dispute happened.
Okay,
First of all, I don't think there's any evidence that the Russians were trying to hack into our election systems to change votes. In fact, they indicated there is no evidence that happened.
Right.
And in fact, anything that did happen, again, we don't know yet. There's not been a lot of evidence put out there. A lot of conclusory things have been put out, so we don't know. But even if we accept the allegations as true, what's the worst that we've done? Hack at the end, and most of us knew about the Democratic Party. I don't see that as a big deal. But even in terms of that, I don't think we know for sure that it was the Russians that did that, and in part because the Democrats never turned over the computers to the FBI. They had their own private company that looked at it, and there's a lot of questions in terms of that. And now the things that you're talking about, there's some question as to whether there was some, what I would call, phishing into U.S. electoral processes, meaning information gathering rather than an attempt to actually manipulate the election.
I would suggest that we're in the early stages of what will be, maybe 50, 100 years from now, a unbelievable, flourishing internet world where we live in, like the 1985 novel Neuromancer, William Gibson, where excuse me, I got this other phone here. That this world is taking over our lives, and so it's a little fresh and a little new, that there are tremendous amounts of questions, and within those questions, conspiracy theories can be derived and whatnot, because there's so much confusion and so much uncertainty. And so there's a lot to discuss, and I agree. I certainly agree with you that the United States has been imperialistically mucking around with the world too much, and is certainly guilty of many, many crimes. But I just want.
I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is.
Speaking of mysteries, we don't know what
we might have lost. Maybe we lost Dan. I don't know. Maybe we did.
Dan?
Hello. Yeah. Hey, you got cut off somehow. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Okay.
Right. But I guess where I was is, I asked you whether some of this hacking or whatever we choose to call it has occurred. But then, of course, where we're at is what does that mean, and how dangerous is it? From what I understand, again, from MSNBC, I watched last night, they were talking about it, that it's not, the danger is not that anyone changed votes, is that there is evidence that somebody, and with tracing it fairly certainly to Russians, from according to what I heard last night, that that they had gone in, and they do have potentially the capacity to muck with rolls. You can go in and you can get the public rolls of people who are voting, and if you can manipulate that in a certain district, or maybe in the future as a threat, that therefore you can completely or significantly discombobulate that district, that ward, so that the vote is undercounted or is not. This is all, again, a little bit conspiracy that, what could happen in the future with more internet mucking around. But at the same time, everything you say about the abuses of the United States imperial system are totally accurate. So all of that seems to be true. How do you respond to kind of? I mean, that's not a very clear question. I grant you that.
Well, it's clear enough. I mean, first of all, I would say, again, a lot of this is potential.
Right.
What the Russians may do in the future. Which I think is, always a guessing game, number one. Number two, I think the other question is, what might they do depending on what we do, and whether we can reach a rapprochement might be the best way to deal with it. Mm-hmm. People are getting knocked off the rolls now, by the way, not by the Russians. There's all kinds of
this could be from anyone, not just the Russians.
Yeah.
It's actually documented. I have to speak up because I'm in Kansas. Our Secretary of State, Chris Kovalik, has spread out to at least 22 states, if not as many as 28. Two other Republican Secretary of States include this thing, a software program called Interstate Crosscheck, and they knock off thousands, tens of thousands of voters, hundreds of thousands of voters routinely, because they have multiple listings of the same name in different states. They find reasons to do that. That's documented. That's actual documented. And I want to throw one more thing in because I happen to know a little bit about hacking and the anonymous hacktivist movement. Russia, it has a domain, is a popular place for many hackers to go to of all countries, including America, to go to use the domains. You can use Tor, T-O-R, to hide where you're coming from and go into Russia and use their Russia Russia VPNs their internet servers and go anywhere else in the world. And there's a guy named former NSA director Bill Binney, who gave an incredible interview just a few weeks ago, and he's been pounding over it. Now, he's a whistleblower who was they tried to throw him in prison, and from the NSA. He was a security director he was the director of the internet security part of the NSA. This guy's an old guy. He knows his stuff real well, and he's been talking on and on about how it's that they know, that the NSA knows that this was not necessarily a Russian agent doing this hacking. It could have been anybody. They just know where it came from what servers. And not only that, he even describes how it can be you can leave footprints, fingerprints of the hack. The hacker can do that by entering into the code Cyrillic or Russian things in order to let the people think that it was a Russian that was doing the hacking. And Bill Binney has got his stuff together on this, and he's been talking about that. And I know enough about it. Dan, I'm sorry, and John, I'm sorry to stick my nose in that, but it's just that it's not just Russia. There's other countries that do the same. They allow this to happen. And
well, again, the internet and the idea of hacking and cyber war and all that is so relatively new, but then burgeoning in such an incredible way that it's sort of ahead of the understanding curve, if you will, that it's just happening so fast and there's so much fear involved that, we probably don't know the half of what's going on. In other words, you could have people hacking and then using furtive things to suggest it's Russian, and so I mean, the problem is that we really, in the end, the bottom line, we really don't know what the hell is going on.
And we never will.
Dan, or
Yeah, I mean, and likely we won't know for sure. I mean, what we need to do, again, the focus should be on, first of all, having a federal electoral system that is uniform in every state, okay? So first of all, it's bizarre that we let every state have its own electoral mechanisms. You end up with the hanging chads in Florida, for example, that sort of thing. So one, we should have a federal system. We need to make sure it's secure. We need to have paper receipts, right? If not, go just back to paper ballots. Plenty of countries do it. We need to deal, of course, with the influence of money in the electoral system.
Well,
with all this gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court is now considering. I mean, the point being, there's a lot of threats to our democracy, and most of them come from inside this country, right? And we need to deal with those. And if there are external threats to our security, we need to, act defensively to protect it. But the idea that's being pushed that somehow Russia is the threat to our democracy and Russia is picking the president of the United States, it's just an absurdity. And
it may be absurd, but I guess I'm sorry, I maybe did interrupt, but it seemed, I agree with it. Absurdity, to me, I've said often, if you don't see it as absurd, you're not, the world we live in, you're not paying attention. But my question would be, how much of this intensity is involved with the absolute absurdity of Donald Trump as President of the United States, and that he may have long-standing oligarchic, if you will, connections, financial connections with, renaissancing, or if that's a word, Russian system, public-private system that, is dealing in billions and billions of dollars or rubles, based on assuming the wreckage of the Soviet Union and turning it into this public-private capitalist, some would say gangster system, and that somehow Donald Trump insinuated himself into that, maybe to his own peril. So that there are all these questions about the absurdity of this unexperienced politician, real estate mogul who is a TV star has become president of the United States, that has thrown such a monkey wrench into the system that people are looking around for scapegoats, and one of them, as your title is Russia. So that the root of all this craziness right now is who we have as president of the United States. Is that a fair?
Well, I think so. I think people. Well, of course, the Democrats are embarrassed that they lost to this guy.
Absolutely.
An impossible
they should
loss,
be, of course. Right?
And they should be. And they've now, by the way, lost their fourth special election in a row since he's been elected. Again, they're unwilling to look at their own shortcomings. But also, I think the country, outside of Trump's base, about 30% of the population, most people are just embarrassed we have him as president. And, I guess feel somehow more comforted by the idea that Russia got him there as opposed to that, there's something wrong with us that we put this man in power. So certainly I think that's part of it. And I agree. Look, I'm sure he's got all kinds of business ties with Russia, and I'm sure
money laundering and whatnot.
And I'm sure that motivated his original desire to have detente with Russia. But what I would say is, one, every politician has all kinds of relationships with all kinds of countries.
Sure.
I mean, you said, oh, this person is really close to England or France, no one would care, right? Because they're our allies. I mean, what does it mean to be so close to Russia? I mean, most of our interests geopolitically, I think, are fairly well aligned with Russia. They're, it all comes down to whether Russia is an enemy, and then that's what makes these interlinkages nefarious. I mean, in for example, Oliver Stone was kind of stymied. He was on, and he's been very supportive of my book, by the way.
Sure. I need to see his interviews,
And he was stymied a lot by Colbert, for example. And he tried to raise, and I know it's a verboten topic, but he tried to raise to no avail. He was cut off. How about the influence of Israel in American politics or Saudi Arabia, for God's sake? I mean, why aren't people talking about that? I mean, we know that that's substantial.
Right.
I mean, in Saudi Arabia, we just sold them $110 billion in arms. It's a retrograde, sexist monarchy that's destroying Yemen. Yemen is barely in the news, right? 7 million people are going to die in Yemen. You know this. This is a holocaust. And we're paying
what the Saudi Arabians and the United States are doing to Yemen is a crime. There's no question. I agree with you on that completely.
And again, there's little discussion about that and why we keep supporting them. And the whole Russia thing, it's just so overblown. The idea that Trump wants to be friends with Russia because he has business interests. I mean, okay, there's always reasons for something, but if the policy makes sense, it makes sense, and I think it makes sense to be friends with Russia. So.
Well, I think it may. I don't know, friends with Russia, but we certainly should be talking with Russia as we talk with China, as we talk with India, as we talk with Brazil, and all these other countries that are they call the rise of the rest to come up and meet the United States as capitalist peers in the brave new world. But as you pointed out earlier, the United States has the largest military in the history of the world that I don't know if there's any pun intended, that trumps every other military around the world. And that we have gotten to the point that brutalizing people is our last resort tactic that we use too much. And how do we, I guess my challenge, my feeling is, how do you educate, if you will, is that the proper word, the American public on all these excesses and outrages and crimes of American history that are still relevant today, and that even, I would say, provoke a lot of the terrorism we see in the world today come back and bite us. I mean, they don't come out of nowhere. That these people are incited by, things that we have tended to do over history.
and even have been supported by us. I mean, that's
absolutely. So how do we?
We live in an Orwellian world in terms of, we're always at war with East Asia. We've always been at war with the United States.
Well, one day you're at war here, the next way you're at war over there, and nobody knows why exactly in the Orwellian world. But
yeah.
Right.
Well,
how do you? I guess to me, it all comes down to one of my pet peeves is critical thinking, and we should be teaching that in school from first grade to 12th grade, so that we get an educated population that is able to actually, maybe hold three ideas, juggle three ideas at the same time, and that kind of thing. Whereas we don't now. We have a population that's besotted by television and, of course, cable news and iPhones and God knows what else, so that we become, as we're assaulted with information, we become more simple-minded in some way. So that what you're talking about should be readily understood, but it's not.
Well, and that's why I wrote the book the way I wrote it. I mean, I think people would be surprised by it because they're going to read a lot of stuff in there that isn't directly even related to Russia. But I agree with what you're saying. Folks need to. We need to have a come to Jesus moment about our own country, right?
Amen. I agree.
The one thing you can say about the Russians have, they've had their own periods of repression, brutality. But the one thing I give them credit for is they've also had moments where they've actually said, hey, we did this and it was wrong. Khrushchev had a secret speech, which wasn't so secret. And he said Stalin was repressive and he killed all these people. And they began a de-Stalinization, right? And then even later, of course, Gorbachev, began so many reforms that the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, the point is, they at least have had some self-reflection. Right. In the U.S., I was just, came up with this analogy the other day. I think Americans, for them, history starts over every day. It's like Groundhog Day. There is no there's no past. No one knows about the Vietnam War. No one, no one.
It's forgetting. It's forgetting as an institution.
Well, and so we're lied into the next war because we forgot that we were just lied into the last one, even in the same country like Iraq, and people not only.
Well, Germany has gone through, as Michael Moore pointed out in his latest film. Germany has gone through a profound recognition. It took them a long time, but a profound recognition of their evils, under Hitler and World War II. And as you say, the Soviet Union or Russia has recognized the excesses of Stalin and that whole period. But both of those nations were broken, or they fell apart, or they were defeated. Whereas the United States has never been defeated. I almost bought a thrift shop the other day for $3 a T-shirt that said "World War Champions," and it's just this proud T-shirt that we were World War champions, and that's, of course, after World War II. That's what we became, and that was our American exceptionalism and all this kind of stuff that we still churn out about ourselves. We have never been beaten. We don't consider ourselves beaten by the Vietnamese. We were beaten by the Vietnamese morally, but we still can't accept that, And all of this is couched in this kind of refusal, forgetting, and refusal to accept these things.
Yeah, and I guess, to your point, I mean, I guess we feel like we essentially we've made many mistakes, but none so critical, as you say, to, it's not so fatal.
Well, we're lucky or whatever, I don't know.
We haven't had to internalize the consequences of our mistakes.
Right.
I mean, we've actually lost some of the wars, I think, but again, they were all overseas. As you mentioned, Vietnam, it wasn't like the Vietnamese were running down the streets in New York killing people. I mean, Yeah, we lost, but we were there. We didn't have to feel the impact of it like other countries do.
Yeah, I just recently wrote, it was on Counterpunch, a long piece on my war 50 years later. And as I ask people always now, if anybody, please think about it, tell me what the Vietnamese ever did against us.
Right.
No one can come up with anything that they ever did against the United States. Oh, they were communists. Well, they also quoted the Declaration of Independence, and they were our ally in World War II. So, they never did anything to us, and then we just tried to destroy their country. No excuse.
And that's and it's true for Iraq, and it's true for Afghanistan. It's true for all these countries.
Yes, it is.
And again, we can kind of, destroy the country and just walk away, wash our hands of it, and forget. And that's what we do over and over.
How do you break this? As a journalist, we're all writers here and journalists. How do we break this blockheaded national syndrome that we're talking about here, and say, look what happened. We slaughtered the occupants of this continent egregiously, genocide, and then we enslaved, people from Africa, and never did them justice after that. All of these legacies of this country that we still, with mass incarceration, we still see examples of the legacy, but we somehow compartmentalize how we address it. I mean, it's people like us are talking about all these things amongst themselves.
No, wait. No, you're not.
Okay, go ahead, Mike.
No, I just want to point out something. One of the reasons I asked you to help me with this, and I'm really happy, it was after I read Dan's introduction to his book and how he became aware. And one of the few, Dan, you're not on YouTube enough, but there's some YouTube videos of him talking about his experience in Colombia. And this is I wanted to ask this question because many of our Kansas listeners are probably getting a little like, well, where's you both of you have traveled in Central America. Dan, you went to Colombia. I guess you went to Nicaragua. I can't remember if John went to Nicaragua during tumultuous
several times. Yeah.
Okay, these were tumultuous times. I guess in the late '80s and early '90s for both of you. Okay, now did you see Russian tanks in Honduras or Did you see Russian military officers in your travels into these areas? Because the way Ronald Reagan, I remember, and I know many Kansans, they are, they think of what Ronald Reagan is some sort of god.
Harlingen, Texas. They were going to come to Harlingen, Texas.
Yeah, they were a 2-day drive from Harlingen, Texas.
So this is how people like us come to, talking to you, people who've been outside the country. This is another valuable thing about Radio Free Kansas that people tell me about, because none of us have ever been outside the country, let alone to these war zones. Like John Grant's been to Iraq in the middle of this shit. And Dan, you were down in Colombia when it was there. You allege, and I don't doubt you, that there were mass murders being committed against labor union activists, and that's one of the few YouTube videos you can watch, listeners.
Well, that's why I was deported from Honduras, because we went there in '84 to talk about labor murders, and they threw us out of the country.
Yeah, but did you see Russians? Were there Russians everywhere down there? I mean, that's what I'm trying to get to.
Well, no, the Russians weren't there at all. The Russians were sort of sympathetic, and but they obeyed the Monroe Doctrine and pretty much stayed out of, as far as I know. But I mean, I'm just one little person.
That's a no. But Dan, did you see a bunch of Russian?
I saw no Russians in Nicaragua and very few Cubans. And of course, what I did see is that the Sandinistas were guarding the U.S. embassy. Yeah, no, I mean, it was a lie. The whole thing was a lie. I mean, we were supporting terrorists against this poor country.
Amen. Yeah.
Who didn't have 3 million people at the time, and it was a disgrace. And then ultimately, of course, Reagan sold arms to Iran to pay for it. It was the most disgraceful thing. And
well, it always struck me. I ran into Guillermo Ungo, who was a leftist FMLN politician once, and I always liked his remark because I'd been to El Salvador a couple of times during that whole Reagan period, and he said, El Salvador is a very tiny place, unless, like me, you walked it through the mountains from one end to the other, and then it's a very, very big place, And in that spirit, I would travel in a place like El Salvador and go into the rebel zones and whatnot, and it would all suddenly make sense to me because I'm talking to people. I'm talking to people in the sense that Guillermo Ungo is talking about walking through these mountains, knowing people and giving them justification for living and all that. And then I would fly home to Miami and then to Philadelphia, and within hours, it would just be crushed by just the aura of what's going on in this massive thing we call the United States. That as Henry Kissinger said, the arc of history didn't pass through Latin America; it passed through north of Latin America, and so the imperial people like Kissinger and all of his cronies and current people, they just don't give credence to these places. That they decide what shall be done with them, and they do it, and they use military forces to do it, and we have all of these problems that we have. I don't know. That's a little aside from me. I don't want to. I don't know how Dan feels about his travels down there. I they were important for him. Yeah.
It profoundly changed me. I mean, honestly, I went to Nicaragua believing that, that my country made mistakes and all that, but we were basically good and we're basically fighting for democracy and freedom, and I left not believing that anymore. I believed that we were doing quite the opposite. And now that, you see unaccompanied minors coming from Central America and people wringing their hands, trying to keep them out and detaining them, you have to go back to the fact we destroyed their countries. That's why they're coming. You know what the irony is? The one country they're not coming from in Central America is Nicaragua.
Right.
And you know why? Because the good guys won. And those are the guys that we were trying to fight.
Clinton and the Honduran coup, which is an outrage. The way Hillary Clinton virtually accepted the 2010 coup, which turned Honduras from a country with a somewhat leftist president into one of the murder capitals of the world now. I mean, the leftists are killed and gunned down quite a lot down there.
And gay activists and union leaders. And again, what for someone like me, what really is, it's just very stark when you see people, they're protesting homophobic laws in Russia, which is fine, they should. But what about in Honduras? Those are our guys.
Yeah,
you got
it. Yeah.
And no one's protesting that. It's as if, Putin is the only one in the world who has these laws or whatever. They're shooting gay activists in Honduras. And as you know, not only did Hillary accept it, she said in her book, Hard Choices, in the hardback version, that she actually played a key role in making sure that Zelaya didn't come back, that elections were held without him coming back. She then excised that from the book when it came out in paperback because she was shocked that people were upset by this. And the two guys, military guys who carried out the coup were trained at the, U.S. School of the Americas. So we had a very intimate, thing. And we never stopped supporting the military, even right after the coup. As I knew, I went there right after the coup. I was there with Father Roy Bouchard, the started.
I know Roy. He's a good friend of mine. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, great guy. We were there within days of the coup to protest it. We flew. We couldn't even get into Tegucigalpa. We flew in the San Pedro Sula and drove. Got a driver to take us to Tegucigalpa. And we went, the first thing we did before we even got to town in Tegucigalpa, we saw the U.S. military base there. So we drove on to the base.
Or whatever,
yeah. I said, well, let's go find out what's going on, because Obama says we've stopped working with the Honduran military because of the coup. So we go over and we talk to this guy, Sergeant Reyes. He says, that isn't true. That's just what we're telling people. He says nothing. You know, and it's just incredible. But
after the coup, it was seen as a point for access for all sorts of American anti-drug war, drug war units that went in there, and Central America is a transshipment point. I know in El Salvador, when I was there from 2010, it was pointed out to me that this huge shopping center that no one seemed to attend was made in San Salvador with lots of drug money that they didn't know what to do with, and they made this huge mall which few people go to. There are problems, but of course that raises the whole issue of the drug war, which we could do another whole show on the excesses of the drug war and the outrages of the drug war on our well-being, if you will.
C-SPAN this morning. Two things happened. An older lady. It's C-SPAN radio listeners, and you can listen to it in Kansas. You can listen to it in the mornings. And they have it's like probably the nation's largest call-in show. It's about politics. And there were two callers struck in my mind today, and they were talking about these Russian hearings, or hearings about the Russians' influence in the United States election specifically yesterday. And this elderly guy called in, and he said, and he sounded like he was just right out of the 1950s. He was saying, the sanctions aren't working. Let's get it on. Let's go kick Russia's ass. And he was just, and he said it in many different ways, but he said those are quotes. Then a lady, then an elderly lady called in, and she said, the country is so confused about Russia. She said, what's really happening is that it's like, she said, if people don't pay attention to what's going on here between the rich and poor in this country, you might see something like the French Revolution. Now, this was an older lady saying this on the telephone, and I was listening to these two conversations, and I thought, I'm getting ready to talk to two guys, been traveled in the world, been outside the United States, and I wanted to ask you, and I asked you, you didn't see any Russians down there in Latin America, and you didn't see any Russians in Iraq when John Grant went there, when you went there, John. So I'm just saying, the Russians are coming, but where? And then is it some sort of plot that Oliver Stone writes a blurb on the front cover of your book, Dan, the plot to Scapegoat Russia, and then he's on Showtime doing an interview with Putin that a lot of my neighbors are talking about. They've got. I don't have Showtime, and I'm waiting for someone to steal it and put it on YouTube. But honestly, what's your connection with Stone? He wrote you a favorable blurb on the front cover of your book. This is this some sort of plot too?
Well, you know what? For me, it was. This is my first book, by the way. So I'm pretty excited about even having this book. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And then I get a blurb by Stone, and how it worked was, it just I don't know. The continuing events. My publishing company, Skyhorse, also published the book tie-in to Snowden, the movie that Stone made. Okay, so they had already been working with him. And so they went to him, sent him my book to ask for a blurb, which is, that's what they do.
Sure.
And he did like the book, and it did relate very nicely to the fact that he was doing these Putin interviews as well. So it ended up being kind of a nice coincidence. And then my publisher also is, and I helped out with this as well, they just put out the Putin interviews, the book version of the interviews that you can get that now.
Okay.
And what we did we added about 200 endnotes, which explained all the things that were being talked about in the interviews, and so that's available. But in any case, so it was just this confluence of events where I was able to get in touch with Stone, and as I said, he liked my book, and I've now met him a couple times, and he's what he told me. This is interesting that I didn't know. One of the reasons he liked my book, he said that, as everyone knows, he fought in Vietnam and he was very disillusioned by what he saw there. But he really didn't come to his awareness of things till he went to Central America afterwards, And
that was exactly my experience. The scales fell from my eyes when I joined the Central America group and went to a trip to Nicaragua and then to El Salvador. So exactly, I understand that arc completely.
So I had a similar arc because of the Central American experience. So anyways, that's kind of how that all came about, and that's been great. And I really admire Stone. He's taken a lot of lumps because of these interviews.
He's one of our artists that understands male power. Norman Mailer was one of, an American artist that understood male power, and so Stone is a provocateur. He's provocative. He likes to make waves, but that's the way information is gotten around in American culture these days. You have to get people's attention. And Oliver Stone is very good at that, and so, I think we certainly need the Oliver Stones, and we need books like yours to wake people up that there is something else going on here than this, media hysteria about Russia, a scapegoat about Russia. That we do need to have. What do you call it? Truth commissions or whatever you would call them in our own culture to figure out who we are and what we're about, and especially how we want to be in the future in this brave new world that's evolving in the future.
Right.
So all this is good. That's all I'm saying.
It is good, and this is your first book. For information purposes, Dan, has C-SPAN approached you about putting you on afterwards or on their Book Talk TV during the weekend?
They have not. I know my publisher's trying to get me on there, so
that would be
that
great. Yeah, I'm telling you, I'm speaking as a Kansan. Showtime. They, like I said, I've got guys talking to me about the Putin interviews with Oliver Stone. I'm going to get a couple more, 2 or 3 copies of your book, and put it on our radio. We have a Radio Free Kansas truck that I've got. It drives around in these rural communities, and I bring books that are not normally at their little village libraries, and pamphlets and booklets. And I'm going to make sure I got a few copies of your book on display to sell to people out here. These guys come up here, told me about the impression they had on the interviews of Putin. They actually sat through what was it, 3 days? I don't have Showtime, but I guess it was
4
3 days.
Yeah,
4
4 hours or something.
Yeah, I had guys driving up to my place, and I watched every one of them, Cadell. And it's like, this is they're one guy said they're shoveling shit down our throats as fast as we could take it. And he's talking about he's talking about the media, you know what I mean, the mainstream media, and he isn't buying it.
And that gives me a lot of hope. That's great. I mean, that's what you want to hear. And I do think there are a lot of people in this country like him who are open to another narrative, who don't buy what's going on, and are hungry for this. And it really does make me very happy. And I'm seeing that, for example, Oliver Stone's book, The Putin Interviews, is doing very, very well. I think despite a lot of people's attempt during that week when it was airing, a lot of folks who had him on, attempts to ridicule him and undermine him, I think people saw through that, and he weathered it.
He's got broad shoulders. He can deal with that, and I think he thrives on that stuff. I like Oliver Stone.
Yeah, he's a good man. But I think there's a lot of hope to educate people, and I guess that goes back to your question. How do we break through this? And I think it's that people need to, who have a different view like we have. We need to get that out there in every way we can. And I just noticed that once you start the discussions, people are very open to them.
Right. Well, we need to keep that openness going and not leap into rash judgments, and then because I think one of the problems here is this issue, as I raised earlier, this issue of Donald Trump as President of the United States, that just weirds so many people out that it he's just given Mad Dog Mattis carte blanche to do what the hell he wants with the United States military, basically, because Donald Trump is kind of clueless. He's so busy now. He's the bloodhounds are on him because of all this other stuff, and so we need to sort of free ourselves of this Trump question and analyze what we should do in this country in the future politically once we move beyond this Trump period. And I think just talking with the Russians is certainly part of that. Not that we should, build up any great adoration of Vladimir Putin, as a great humanitarian or something. He's who he is.
Right. I think people are confused. Many Trump voters out here.
But you certainly have to sit down and talk to them, and
right.
We don't want to go to war with them, and he certainly doesn't want to go to war with us. So
right, and the Trump voters out here are not necessarily confused. Well, yeah, they're confused because here Trump basically said things they wanted to hear about Russia and WikiLeaks, and then he gets in office and starts doing what he's doing now. And then there's I'm telling you, these people out here I think they're coming to grips with the realization they've been conned by this guy. But fundamentally, war with Russia is far down. War period. Really, among many people out here. By the way, that was an Iraq veteran who went out of his trouble to drive 6 miles over to my remote farm to tell me about shoveling shit down our throats, and he'd watched all 4 days of the Putin interviews. So, I'm just saying, this is, I don't think we're as gullible of idiots as they think we are. Dan, where are you going after this? Are you booking interviews on audio or other shows that we can catch up with you and follow you?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. It seems I have an interview, almost every day.
Good.
On various things. I've been on RT a lot. You can Google. You can now start finding. I know you said I'm not on YouTube much, but you can find a lot of interviews of me now if you just Google my name and look for videos. I'm also going to be doing some traveling. Particularly, I was invited to the Bay Area for several days. I'm going to go to a bunch of bookstores there. I'm going to Los Angeles. I'm going to be interviewed by Abby Martin in early August. For Telesur, which I'm quite excited about. So I'm out there, and I'm really heavily on Twitter. I'm at Daniel M. Kovalik on Twitter, and I find that a very useful tool to find and to share information. So I'd love for people to follow me on Twitter as well.
That's how I found you. That's how I hooked up to Twitter.
There you go.
Twitter.
Yeah.
And his last name's, listeners, is spelled Kovalik. Is that correct?
That is right. In the book.
Well,
Daniel
thanks for talking to us today, Dan.
Well, thank you. Really. It was a pleasure and an honor for me, and I hope our paths will cross in the future.
It will, and remember, you're talking to the heartland in Radio Free Kansas. So you're reaching right where it needs to be. You're reaching right where it needs to be going. So
I'm proud to be talking. Thank you so much.
All right.
Well, you've been listening.